Section 11 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Catherine Crowe. Chapter 9, Apparitions, Part 1. The number of stories on record, which seem to support the views I have suggested in my last chapter, is, I fancy, little suspected by people in general, and still less is it imagined that similar occurrences are yet frequently taking place. I had, indeed, myself no idea of either one circumstance or the other, till my attention being accidentally turned in this direction, I was led into inquiries, the result of which has extremely surprised me. I do not mean to imply that all my acquaintance are ghost-seers, or that these things happen every day, but the amount of what I do mean is this. First, that besides the numerous instances of such phenomena alluded to in history, which have been treated as fables by those who profess to believe the rest of the narratives, though the whole rests upon the same foundation, that is, tradition and hearsay, besides these, there exists in one form or another hundreds and hundreds of recorded cases, in all countries and in all languages, exhibiting that degree of similarity which marked them as belonging to a class of facts, many of these being of a nature which seems to preclude the possibility of bringing them under the theory of spectral illusions, and, secondly, that I scarcely meet any one man or woman who, if I can induce them to believe I will not publish their names, and am not going to laugh at them, is not prepared to tell me of some occurrence of the sort, as having happened to themselves, their family, or their friends. I admit that, in many instances, they terminate their narration by saying that they think it must have been an illusion, because they cannot bring themselves to believe in ghosts, not unfrequently adding that they wish to think so, since to think otherwise would make them uncomfortable. I confess, however, that this seems to me a very unwise as well as a very unsafe way of treating the matter. Believing the appearance to be an illusion, because they cannot bring themselves to believe in ghosts, simply amounts to saying, I don't believe because I don't believe, and is an argument of no effect, except to invalidate their capacity for judging the question at all. But the second reason for not believing, namely, that they do not wish to do so, has not only the same disadvantage, but is liable to much more serious objections. For it is our duty to ascertain the truth in an affair that concerns every soul of us so deeply, and to shrink from looking at it, lest it should disclose something we do not like, is an expedient as childish as it is desperate. In reviewing my late novel of Lily Dawson, where I announce the present work, I observed that while some of the reviewers scout the very idea of anybody's believing in ghosts, others, less rash, while they admit that it is a subject we know nothing about, object to further investigation, on account of the terrors and uncomfortable feelings that will be engendered. Now, certainly, if it were a matter in which we had no personal concern, and which belonged merely to the region of speculative curiosity, everybody would be perfectly justified in following their inclinations with regard to it. There would be no reason for frightening themselves, if they did not like it. But, since it is perfectly certain that the fate of these poor ghosts, be what it may, will be ours some day, perhaps before another year or another week has passed over our heads. To shut our eyes to the truth, because it may, perchance, occasion us some uncomfortable feelings, is surely a strange mixture of contemptible cowardice and daring temerity. If it be true that, by some law of nature, departed souls occasionally revisit the earth, we may be quite certain that it was intended we should know it, and that the law is to some good end. For no law of God can be purposeless or mischievous. And is it conceivable that we should say we will not know it, because it is disagreeable to us? Is not this very like saying, "Let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die," and yet refusing to inquire what is to become of us when we do die? Refusing to avail ourselves of that demonstrative proof which God has mercifully placed within our reach? And with all this obstinacy, people do not get rid of the apprehension. They go on struggling against it and keeping it down by argument and reason. But there are very few persons indeed, men or women, who, when placed in a situation calculated to suggest the idea, do not feel the intuitive conviction striving within them. In the ordinary circumstances of life, nobody suffers from this terror. In the extraordinary ones, I find the professed disbelievers not much better off than the believers. Not long ago I heard a lady expressing the great alarm she should have felt had she been exposed to spend a whole night on Ben Lomond, as Margaret Fuller, the American authoress, did lately. For, she said, though I don't believe in ghosts, I should have been dreadfully afraid of seeing one then. Moreover, though I do not suppose that man, in his normal state, could ever encounter an incorporeal spirit without considerable awe, I am inclined to think that the extreme terror the idea inspires arises from bad training. The ignorant frighten children with ghosts, and the better educated assure them there is no such thing. Our understanding may believe the latter, but our instincts believe the former, so that, out of this education, we retain the terror, and just belief enough to make it very troublesome whenever we are placed in circumstances that awaken it. Now, perhaps, if the thing were differently managed, the result might be different. Suppose the subject were duly investigated, and it were ascertained that the views which I and many others are disposed to entertain with regard to it are correct. And suppose, then, children were calmly told that it is not impossible, but that, on some occasion, they may see a departed friend again, that the laws of nature, established by an all-wise Providence, admit of the dead sometimes revisiting the earth, doubtless for the benevolent purpose of keeping alive in us our faith in a future state, that death is merely a transition to another life, which it depends on ourselves to make happy or otherwise, and that while those spirits which appear bright and blessed may well be objects of our envy, the others should excite only our intense compassion. I am persuaded that a child so educated would feel no terror at the sight of an apparition, more especially as there very rarely appears to be anything terrific in the aspect of these forms. They generally come in their habits as they lived, and appear so much like the living person in the flesh, that, where they are not known to be already dead, they are frequently mistaken for them. There are exceptions to this rule, but the forms in themselves rarely exhibit anything to create alarm. As a proof that a child would not naturally be terrified at the sight of an apparition, I will adduce the following instance, the authenticity of which I can vouch for. A lady with her child embarked on board a vessel at Jamaica, for the purpose of visiting her friends in England, leaving her husband behind her quite well. It was a sailing packet, and they had been some time at sea, when one evening, while the child was kneeling before her, saying his prayers previous to going to rest, he suddenly said, "Mamma, papa!" "Nonsense, my dear," the mother answered. "You know your papa is not here." "He is, mamma," returned the child. "He is looking at us now." Nor could she convince him to the contrary. When she went on deck, she mentioned the circumstance to the captain, who thought it so strange that he said he would note down the date of the occurrence. The lady begged him not to do so, saying it was attaching a significance to it which would make her miserable. He did it, however, and shortly after her arrival in England, she learned that her husband had died exactly at that period. I have met with other instances in which children have seen apparitions without exhibiting any alarm, and in the case of Frederica Hauf, the infant in her arms was frequently observed to point smilingly to those which she herself said she saw. In the above related case, we find a valuable example of an apparition which we cannot believe to have been a mere subjective phenomenon, being seen by one person and not by another. The receptivity of the child may have been greater, or the rapport between it and its father stronger, but this occurrence inevitably leads us to suggest how often our departed friends may be near us, and we not see them. A Mr. B., with whom I am acquainted, informed me, some years ago, he lost 2 children. There was an interval of 2 years between their deaths, and about as long a period had elapsed since the decease of the second, when the circumstance I am about to relate took place. It may be conceived that at that distance of time, however vivid the impression had been at first, it had considerably faded from the mind of a man engaged in business; and he assures me that, on the night this event occurred, he was not thinking of the children at all. He was, moreover, perfectly well, and had neither eaten nor drank anything unusual, nor abstained from eating or drinking anything to which he was accustomed. He was therefore in his normal state, when shortly after he had lain down in bed, and before he had fallen asleep, he heard the voice of one of the children say, "Papa, papa." "Do you hear that?" he said to his wife, who lay beside him. "I hear Archie calling me, as plain as I ever heard him in my life." "Nonsense," returned the lady. "You are fancying it." But presently he heard, "Papa, papa," and now both voices spoke. Upon which, exclaiming, "I can stand this no longer," he started up, and, drawing back the curtains, saw both children in their night dresses, standing near the bed. He immediately jumped out, whereupon they retreated slowly, and with their faces toward him, to the window, where they disappeared. He says that the circumstance made a great impression upon him at the time, and indeed that it was one that could never be effaced; but he did not know what to think of it, not believing in ghosts, and therefore concluded it must have been some extraordinary spectral illusion, especially as his wife heard nothing. It may have been so, but that circumstance by no means proves it. From these varying degrees of susceptibility or affinity, there seems to arise another consequence, namely, that more than one person may see the same object, and yet see it differently; and I mention this particularly, because it is one of the objections that unreflecting persons make to phenomena of this kind, second sight especially. In the remarkable instance which is recorded to have occurred at Ripley, in the year 1812, to which I shall allude more particularly in a future chapter, much stress was laid on the fact that the first seer said, "Look at those beasts," while the second answered, "They were not beasts but men." In a former chapter I mentioned the case of a lady, on board a ship, seeing and feeling a sort of blue cloud hanging over her, which afterward, as it retired, assumed a human form, though still appearing a vapory substance. Now, possibly, had her receptivity, or the rapport, been greater, she might have seen the distinct image of her dying friend. I have met with several instances of these cloudy figures being seen, as if the spirit had built itself up a form of atmospheric air, and it is remarkable that when other persons perceived the apparitions that frequented the Seers of Prevorst, some saw these as cloudy forms, which she saw distinctly attired in the costume they wore when alive, and thus, on some occasions, apparitions are represented as being transparent, while on others they have not been distinguishable from the real corporeal body. All these discrepancies, and others, to be hereafter alluded to, are doubtless only absurd to our ignorance. They are the results of physical laws, as absolute, though not so easily ascertained, as those by which the most ordinary phenomena around us are found explicable. With respect to these cloudy forms, I have met with 4 instances lately, 2 occurring to ladies and 2 to gentlemen, the one a minister and the other a man engaged in business; and although I am quite aware that these cases are not easily to be distinguished from those of spectral illusion, yet I do not think them so myself, and as they occurred to persons in their normal state of health, who never before or since experienced anything of the kind, and who could find nothing in their own circumstances to account for its happening then, I shall mention them. In the instances of the gentleman and one of the ladies, they were suddenly awakened, they could not tell by what, and perceived bending over them a cloudy form, which immediately retreated slowly to the other end of the room, and disappeared. In the 4th case, which occurred to an intimate friend of my own, she had not been asleep, but having been the last person up in the house, had just stepped into the bed, where her sister had already been some time asleep. She was perfectly awake, when her attention was attracted by hearing the clink of glass, and, on looking up, she saw a figure standing on the hearth, which was exactly opposite her side of the bed, and as there was water and a tumbler there, she concluded that her sister had stepped out at the bottom, unperceived by her, and was drinking. While she was carelessly observing the figure, it moved toward the bed, and laid a heavy hand upon her, pressing her arm in a manner that gave her pain. "Oh, Maria, don't!" she exclaimed; but as the form retreated, and she lost sight of it, a strange feeling crept over her, and she stretched out her hand to ascertain if her sister was beside her. She was, and asleep; but this movement awoke her, and she found the other now in considerable agitation. She of course tried to persuade her that it was a dream, or nightmare, as did the family the next day; but she was quite clear in her mind at the time, and she then assured me that it was neither one nor the other, though now, at the distance of a year from the occurrence, she is very desirous of putting that construction upon it. As somebody will be ready to suggest that this was a freak played by one of the family, I can only answer that that is an explanation that no one who is acquainted with all the circumstances could admit; added to which, the figure did not disappear in the direction of the door, but in quite an opposite one. A very singular thing happened to the accomplished authoress of Letters from the Baltic, on which my readers may put what interpretation they please, but I give it here as a pendant to the last story. The night before she left Petersburg she passed in the house of a friend. The room appropriated to her use was a large dining room, in which a temporary bed was placed, and a folding screen was so arranged as to give an air of comfort to the nook where the bed stood. She went to bed, and to sleep, and no one who knows her can suspect her of seeing spectral illusions, or being incapable of distinguishing her own condition when she saw anything whatever. As she was to commence her journey on the following day, she had given orders to be called at an early hour, and accordingly she found herself awakened toward morning by an old woman in a complete Russian costume, who looked at her, nodding and smiling, and intimating, as she supposed, that it was time to rise. Feeling, however, very sleepy, and very unwilling to do so, she took her watch from behind her pillow, and, looking at it, perceived that it was only 4 o'clock. As, from the costume of the old woman, she knew her to be a Russian, and therefore not likely to understand any language she could speak, she shook her head and pointed to the watch, giving her to understand that it was too early. The woman looked at her and nodded, and then retreated, while the traveler lay down again and soon fell asleep. By and by she was awakened by a knock at the door, and the voice of the maid whom she had desired to call her. She bade her come in, but the door being locked on the inside, she had to get out of bed to admit her. It now occurred to her to wonder how the old woman had entered, but, taking it for granted that there was some other mode of ingress, she did not trouble herself about it, but dressed and descended to breakfast. Of course the inquiry usually addressed to a stranger was made. They hoped she had slept well. Perfectly, she said, only that one of their good people had been somewhat over anxious to get her up in the morning, and then she mentioned the old woman's visit. But to her surprise, they declared they had no such person in the family. It must have been some old nurse or laundress or something of that sort, she suggested. Impossible, they answered. You must have dreamed the whole thing. We have no old woman in the house, nobody wearing that costume, and nobody could have got in, since the door must have been fastened long after that. And these assertions the servants fully confirmed, added to which I should observe that the house, like foreign houses in general, consisted of a flat or floor shut in by a door, which separated it entirely from the rest of the building, and, being high up from the street, nobody could even have gained access by a window. The lady, now beginning to get somewhat puzzled, inquired if there were any second entrance into the room, but, to her surprise, she heard there was not, and she then mentioned that she had locked the door on going to bed, and had found it locked in the morning. The thing has remained utterly inexplicable, and the family, who were much more amazed by it than she was, would willingly believe it to have been a dream, but, whatever the interpretation of it may be, she feels quite certain that that is not the true one. I make no comments on the above case, though a very inexplicable one, and I scarcely know whether to mention any of those well-established tales, which appear to be certainly as satisfactorily attested as any circumstance which is usually taken simply on report. I allude particularly to the stories of General Wynyard, Lord Tyrone, and Lady Beresford, the case which took place at Havant, in Hampshire, and which is related in a letter from Mr. Caswell the mathematician to Dr. Bentley, that which occurred in Cornwall, as narrated by the Reverend Mr. Ruddle, one of the prebendaries of Exeter, whose assistance and advice were asked, and who himself had 2 interviews with the spirit, and many others, which are already published in different works, especially in a little book entitled Accredited Ghost Stories. I may, however, mention that, with respect to those of Lady Beresford and General Wynyard, the families of the parties have always maintained their entire belief in the circumstances, as do the family of Lady Betty Cobb, who took the riband from Lady Beresford's arm after she was dead, she having always worn it since her interview with the apparition, in order to conceal the mark he had left by touching her. There have been many attempts to explain away the story of Lord Littleton's warning, although the evidence for it certainly satisfied the family, as we learn from Dr. Johnson, who said, in regard to it, that it was the most extraordinary thing that had happened in his day, and that he heard it from the lips of Lord Westcote, the uncle of Lord Littleton. There is a sequel, however, to this story, which is extremely well authenticated, though much less generally known. It appears that Mr. Miles Peter Andrews, the intimate friend of Lord Littleton, was at his house at Dartford, when Lord L. died at Pitt Place, Epsom, 30 miles off. Mr. Andrews' house was full of company, and he expected Lord Littleton, whom he had left in his usual state of health, to join him the next day, which was Sunday. Mr. Andrews himself, feeling rather indisposed on the Saturday evening, retired early to bed, and requested Mrs. Pigou, one of his guests, to do the honors of his supper table. He admitted, for he is himself the authority for the story, that he fell into a feverish sleep on going to bed, but was awakened between 11 and 12 by somebody opening his curtains, which proved to be Lord Littleton in a nightgown and cap, which Mr. Andrews recognized. Lord Littleton spoke, saying that he was come to tell him all was over. It appears that Lord Littleton was fond of practical joking, and as Mr. Andrews entertained no doubt whatever of his visitor being Lord Littleton himself, in the body, he supposed that this was one of his tricks, and stretching his arm out of bed, he took hold of his slippers, the nearest thing he could get at, and threw them at him, whereupon the figure retreated to a dressing-room, which had no ingress or egress except through the bedchamber. Upon this, Mr. Andrews jumped out of bed to follow him, intending to chastise him further, but he could find nobody in either of the rooms, although the door was locked on the inside. So he rang his bell, and inquired who had seen Lord Littleton. Nobody had seen him, but, though how had he got in or out of the room remained an enigma. Mr. Andrews asserted that he was certainly there, and, angry at the supposed trick, he ordered that they should give him no bed, but let him go and sleep at the inn. Lord Littleton, however, appeared no more, and Mr. Andrews went to sleep, not entertaining the slightest suspicion that he had seen an apparition. It happened that, on the following morning, Mrs. Pigou had occasion to go at an early hour to London, and great was her astonishment to learn that Lord Littleton had died on the preceding night. She immediately dispatched an express to Dartford with the news, upon the receipt of which Mr. Andrews, then quite well, and remembering perfectly all that had happened, swooned away. He could not understand it, but it had a most serious effect upon him, and, to use his own expression, he was not his own man again for 3 years. There are various authorities for this story, the correctness of which is vouched for by some members of Mrs. Pigou's family, with whom I am acquainted, who have frequently heard the circumstances detailed by herself, and who assure me it was always believed by the family. I really, therefore, do not see what grounds we have for doubting either of these facts. Lord Westcote, on whose word Dr. Johnson founded his belief of Lord Littleton's warning, was a man of strong sense, and that the story was not looked upon lightly by the family, is proved by the fact that the Dowager Lady Littleton had a picture, which was seen by Sir Nathaniel Wraxall in her house in Portugal Street, as mentioned in his memoirs, wherein the event was commemorated. His lordship is in bed, the dove appears at the window, and a female figure stands at the foot of the couch, announcing to the unhappy profligate his approaching dissolution. That he mentioned the warning to his valet, and some other persons, and that he talked of jockeying the ghost by surviving the time named, is certain, as is also that he died with his watch in his hand, precisely at the appointed period. Mr. Andrews says that he was subject to fits of strangulation, from a swelling in the throat, which might have killed him at any moment, but his decease having proceeded from a natural and obvious cause, does not interfere one way or the other with the validity of the prediction, which simply foretold his death at a particular period, not that there was to be anything preternatural in the manner of it. As I find so many people willing to believe in wraiths, who cannot believe in ghosts, that is, they are overpowered by the numerous examples and the weight of evidence for the first. It would be desirable if we could ascertain whether these wraiths are seen before the death occurs or after it. But, though the day is recorded, and seems always to be one in which the death took place, and the hour about the same, minutes are not sufficiently observed to enable us to answer that question. It would be an interesting one, because the argument advanced by those who believe that the dead never are seen is, that it is the strong will and desire of the expiring person which enables him so to act on the nervous system of his distant friend, that the imagination of the latter projects the form and sees it as if objectively. By imagination, I do not simply mean to convey the common notion implied by that much abused word, which is only fancy, but the constructive imagination, which is a much higher function, and which, inasmuch as man is made in the likeness of God, bears a distant relation to that sublime power by which the Creator projects, creates, and upholds his universe, while the far-reaching of the departing spirit seems to consist in the strong will to do, reinforced by the strong faith that it can be done. We have rarely the strong will, and still more rarely the strong faith, without which the will remains ineffective. In the following case, which is perfectly authentic, the apparition of Major R was seen several hours after his death had occurred. In the year 1785, some cadets were ordered to proceed from Madras to join their regiments up the country. A considerable part of the journey was to be made in a barge, and they were under the conduct of a senior officer, Major R. In order to relieve the monotony of the voyage, this gentleman proposed, one day, that they should make a shooting excursion inland, and walk round to meet the boat at a point agreed on, which, owing to the windings of the river, it would not reach till evening. They accordingly took their guns, and, as they had to cross a swamp, Major R, who was well acquainted with the country, put on a heavy pair of top boots, which, together with an odd limp he had in his gait, rendered him distinguishable from the rest of the party at a considerable distance. When they reached the jungle, they found there was a wide ditch to leap, which all succeeded in doing except the major, who, being less young active, jumped short of the requisite distance, and although he scrambled up unhurt, he found his gun so crammed full of wet sand that it would be useless till thoroughly cleansed. He therefore bade them walk on, saying he would follow, and taking off his hat, he sat down in the shade, where they left him. When they had been beating about for game some time, they began to wonder why the major did not come on, and they shouted to let him know whereabouts they were, but there was no answer, and hour after hour passed without his appearance, till at length they began to feel somewhat uneasy. Thus the day wore away, and they found themselves approaching the rendezvous. The boat was in sight, and they were walking down to it, wondering how their friend could have missed them, when suddenly, to their great joy, they saw him before them, making toward the barge. He was without his hat or gun, limping hastily along in his top boots, and did not appear to observe them. They shouted after him, but as he did not look round, they began to run, in order to overtake him, and indeed, fast as he went, they did gain considerably upon him. Still he reached the boat first, crossing the plank which the boatmen had placed ready for the gentleman they saw approaching. He ran down the companion stairs, and they after him, but inexpressible was their surprise when they could not find him below. They ascended again, and inquired of the boatmen what had become of him, but they declared he had not come on board, and that nobody had crossed the plank till the young men themselves had done so. Confounded and amazed at what appeared so inexplicable, and doubly anxious about their friend, they immediately resolved to trace their steps in search of him, and, accompanied by some Indians who knew the jungle, they made their way back to the spot where they had left him. Thence some footmarks enabled them to trace him, till, at a very short distance from the ditch, they found his hat and his gun. Just then the Indians called out to them to beware, for that there was a sunken well thereabouts, into which they might fall. An apprehension naturally seized them that this might have been the fate of their friend, and on examining the edge, they saw a mark as of a heel slipping up. Upon this, one of the Indians consented to go down, having a rope with which they had provided themselves tied round his waist; for, aware of the existence of the wells, the natives suspected what had actually occurred, namely, that the unfortunate gentleman had slipped into one of these traps, which, being overgrown with brambles, were not discernible by the eye. With the assistance of the Indian, the body was brought up and carried back to the boat, amid the deep regrets of the party, with whom he had been a great favorite. They proceeded with it to the next station, where an inquiry was instituted as to the manner of his death, but of course there was nothing more to be elicited. I give this story as related by one of the parties present, and there is no doubt of its perfect authenticity. He says he can in no way account for the mystery. He can only relate the fact, and not one, but the whole 5 cadets, saw him as distinctly as they saw each other. It was evident, from the spot where the body was found, which was not many hundred yards from the well, that the accident must have occurred very shortly after they left him. When the young men reached the boat, Major R. must have been, for some 7 or 8 hours, a denizen of the other world. Yet he kept the rendezvous. There was a similar occurrence in Devonshire, some years back, which happened to the well-known Dr. Hawker, who, one night in the street, observed an old woman pass him, to whom he was in the habit of giving a weekly charity. Immediately after she had passed, he felt somebody pull his coat, and on looking round saw it was her, whereupon he put his hand in his pocket to seek for a sixpence, but on turning to give it to her, she was gone. He thought nothing about it, but when he got home, he inquired if she had had her money that week, when, to his amazement, he heard she was dead, but his family had forgotten to mention the circumstance. I have met with 2 curious cases, occurring in Edinburgh, of years late. In one, a young man and his sister were in their kitchen, warming themselves over the fire before they retired to bed, when, on raising their eyes, they both saw a female figure, dressed in white, standing in the doorway and looking at them. She was leaning against one of the doorposts. Miss E., the young lady, screamed, whereupon the figure advanced, crossed the kitchen toward a closet, and disappeared. There was no egress at the closet, and as they lived in a flat, and the door was closed for the night, a stranger could neither have entered the house nor got out of it. In the other instance, there were 2 houses on one flat, the doors opposite each other. In one of the houses there resided a person with her 2 daughters, grown-up women. In the other lived a shoemaker and his wife. The latter died, and it was said her husband had ill-treated her and worried her out of the world. He was a drunken, dissipated man, and used to be out till a late hour most nights, while this poor woman sat up for him, and when she heard a voice on the stairs, or a bell, she used often to come out and look over to see if it were her husband returned. One night, when she had been dead some weeks, the 2 young women were ascending the stairs to their own door when, to their amazement, they both saw her standing at the top, looking over as she used to do in her lifetime. At the same moment their mother opened the door and saw the figure also. The girls rushed past, overcome with terror, and one, if not both, fainted as soon as they got into the door. The youngest fell on her face in the passage. Another case, which occurred in this town, I mention, although I know it is liable to be called a spectral illusion, because it bears a remarkable similarity to one which took place in America. A respectable woman lost her father, for whom she had great affection. She was of a serious turn, and much attached to the tenets of her church, in which particular she thought her father had been deficient. She was therefore very unhappy about him, fearing that he had not died in a proper state of mind. A considerable time had elapsed since his death, but her distrust of his condition was still causing her uneasiness, when one day, while she was sitting at her work, she felt something touch her shoulder, and on looking round she perceived her father, who bade her cease to grieve about him, as he was not unhappy. From that moment she became perfectly resigned and cheerful. The American case, I have omitted to write down the name of the place, and forget it, was that of a mother and son. She was also a highly respectable person, and was described to me as perfectly trustworthy by one who knew her. She was a widow, and had one son, to whom she was extremely attached. He, however, disappeared one day, and she never could learn what had become of him. She always said that if she did but know his fate, she should be happier. At length, when he had been dead a considerable time, her attention was one day, while reading, attracted by a slight noise, which induced her to look round, and she saw her son, dripping with water, and with a sad expression of countenance. The features, however, presently relaxed, and they assumed a more pleasing aspect before he disappeared. From that time she ceased to grieve, and it was subsequently ascertained that the young man had run away to sea, but no more was known of him. Certain it was, however, that she attributed her recovered tranquillity to having seen her son as above narrated. A lady with whom I am acquainted was one day, when a girl, standing at the top of the stairs, with two others, discussing their games, when they each suddenly exclaimed, "Who's that?" There was a fourth among them, a girl in a checked pinafore, but she was gone again. They had all seen her. One day a younger brother, in the same house, was playing with a whip, when he suddenly laughed at something and cried, "Take that!" and described having seen the same girl. This led to some inquiry, and it was said that such a girl as they described had lived in that house, and had died from the bite of a mad dog, or rather had been smothered between two feather beds, but whether that was actually done, or was only a report, I cannot say. Supposing this to have been no illusion, and I really cannot see how it could be one, the memory of past sports and pleasures seems to have so survived as to have attracted the young soul, prematurely cut off, to the spot where the same sports and pleasures were being enjoyed by the living. A maid servant in one of the Midland counties of England, being up early one morning, heard her name called in a voice that seemed to be her brother's, a sailor then at sea, and running up, she found him standing in the hall. He said he was coming from afar, and was going again, and mentioned some other things, when her mistress, hearing voices, called to know who she was talking to. She said it was her brother from sea. After speaking to her for some time, she suddenly lost sight of him, and found herself alone. Amazed and puzzled, she told her mistress what had happened, who, being led thus to suspect the kind of visitor it was, looked out of the window to ascertain if there were any marks of footsteps, the ground being covered with snow. There were, however, none, and it was therefore clear that nobody could have entered the house. Intelligence afterward arrived of the young man's death. This last is a case of wraith, but a more complicated one, from the circumstance of speech being superadded. But this is not by any means an isolated particular. There are many such. The author of the book called Accredited Ghost Stories, whose name I at this moment forget, and I have not the book at hand, gives, on his own authority, the following circumstance, professing to be acquainted with the parties. A company were visiting York Cathedral, when a gentleman and lady, who had detached themselves from the rest, observed an officer wearing a naval uniform approaching them. He walked quickly, saying to the lady as he passed, "There is another world." The gentleman, seeing her greatly agitated, pursued the stranger, but lost sight of him, and nobody had seen such a person but themselves. On returning to his companion, she told him that it was her brother, who was then abroad with his ship, and with whom she had frequently held discussions as to whether there was, or was not, a future life. The news of the young man's death shortly reached the family. In this case the brother must have been dead. The spirit must have passed out of this world into that other, the existence of which he came to certify. This is one of those cases which, happening not long ago, leads one especially to regret the want of moral courage which prevents people giving up their names and avowing their experience. The author of the above-mentioned book, from which I borrow this story, says that the sheet had gone to press with the real names of the parties attached, but that he was requested to withdraw them, as it would be painful to the family. My view of this case is so different that, had it occurred to myself, I should have felt it my imperative duty to make it known and give every satisfaction to inquirers. End of section 11. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. Section 12 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Catherine Crowe. Chapter 9, Apparitions, Part 2. Some years ago, during the war, when Sir Robert H.E. was in the Netherlands, he happened to be quartered with two other officers, one of whom was dispatched into Holland on an expedition. One night, during his absence, Sir R.H.E. awoke, and, to his great surprise, saw this absent friend sitting on the bed which he used to occupy, with a wound in his breast. Sir Robert immediately awoke his companion, who saw the spectre also. The latter then addressed them, saying that he had been that day killed in a skirmish, and that he had died in great anxiety about his family. Wherefore he had come to communicate that there was a deed of much consequence to them deposited in the hands of a certain lawyer in London, whose name and address he mentioned, adding that this man's honesty was not to be altogether relied on. He therefore requested that, on their return to England, they would go to his house and demand the deed, but that, if he denied possession of it, they were to seek it in a certain drawer in his office, which he described to them. The circumstance impressed them very much at that time, but a long time had elapsed ere they reached England, during which period they had gone through so many adventures and seen so many friends fall around them, that this impression was considerably weakened, insomuch that each went to his own home and his own pursuits without thinking of fulfilling the commission they had undertaken. Some time afterward, however, it happened that they both met in London, and they then resolved to seek the street that had been named to them, and ascertain if such a man lived there. They found him, requested an interview, and demanded the deed, the possession of which he denied. but their eyes were upon the drawer that had been described to them, where they asserted it to be, and being there discovered, it was delivered into their hands. Here also the soul had parted from the body, while the memory of the past and an anxiety for the worldly prosperity of those left behind survived, and we thus see that the condition of mind in which this person had died remained unchanged. He was not indifferent to the worldly prosperity of his relatives, and he found his own state rendered unhappy by the fear that they might suffer from the dishonesty of his agent. It may here be naturally objected that hundreds of much-loved widows and orphans have been ruined by dishonest trustees and agents, where no ghost came back to instruct them in the means of obviating the misfortune. This is, no doubt, a very legitimate objection, and one which it is very difficult to answer. I must, however, repeat what I said before. Nature is full of exceptional cases. While we know very little of the laws which regulate these exceptions, but we may see a very good reason for the fact that such communications are the exception, and not the rule. For if they were the latter, the whole economy of this earthly life would be overturned, and its affairs must necessarily be conducted in a totally different manner to that which prevails at present. What the effects of such an arrangement of nature would be, had it pleased God to make it, he alone knows. But certain it is, that man's freedom, as a moral agent, would be in a great degree abrogated, were the barriers that impede our intercourse with the spiritual world removed. It may be answered that this is an argument which may be directed against the fact of such appearances being permitted at all, but that is a fallacious objection. Earthquakes and hurricanes are occasionally permitted, which overthrow the work of man's hands for centuries. But if these convulsions of nature were of everyday occurrence, nobody would think it worth their while to build a house or cultivate the earth, and the world would be a wreck and a wilderness. The apparitions that do appear are not without their use to those who believe in them, while there is too great an uncertainty attending the subject, generally, to allow of its ever being taken into consideration in mundane affairs. The old so-called superstition of the people, that a person's dying with something on his mind is one of the frequent causes of these revisitings, seems, like most other superstitions, to be founded on experience. I meet with many cases in which some apparently trivial anxiety, or some frustrated communication, prevents the uneasy spirit flinging off the bonds that bind it to the earth. I could quote many examples characterized by this feature, but will confine myself to 2 or 3. Young Steeling gives a very curious one, which occurred in the year 1746, and for the authenticity of which he vouches. A gentleman of the name of Dorian, of most excellent character and amiable disposition, who was tutor in the Carolina colleges at Brunswick, died there in that year, and immediately previous to his death he sent to request an interview with another tutor, of the name of Hofer, with whom he had lived on terms of friendship. Hofer obeyed the summons, but came too late. The dying man was already in the last agonies. After a short time, rumors began to circulate that Herr Dorian had been seen by different persons about the college, but as it was with the pupils that these rumors originated, they were supposed to be mere fancies, and no attention whatever was paid to them. At length, however, in the month of October, 3 months after the decease of Herr Dorian, a circumstance occurred that excited considerable amazement among the professors. It formed part of the duty of Hofer to go through the college every night, between the hours of 11 and 12, for the purpose of ascertaining that all the scholars were in bed, and that nothing irregular was going on among them. On the night in question, on entering one of the anterooms in the execution of this duty, he saw, to his great amazement, Herr Dorian seated in the dressing gown and white cap he was accustomed to wear, and holding the latter with his right hand, in such a manner as to conceal the upper part of the face, from the eyes to the chin. However, it was distinctly visible. This unexpected sight naturally startled Hofer, but, summoning resolution, he advanced into the young men's chamber, and having ascertained that all was in order, closed the door. He then turned his eyes again toward the spectre, and there it sat, as before, whereupon he went up to it, and stretched out his arm toward it. But he was now seized with such a feeling of indescribable horror that he could scarcely withdraw his hand, which became swollen to a degree that for some months he had no use of it. On the following day he related this circumstance to the professor of mathematics, Oeder, who of course treated the thing as a spectral illusion. He, however, consented to accompany Hofer on his rounds the ensuing night, satisfied that he should be able either to convince him it was a mere phantasm, or else a spectre of flesh and blood that was playing him a trick. They accordingly went at the usual hour, but no sooner had the professor set his foot in that same room than he exclaimed, "By heavens, it's Dorian himself!" Hofer, in the meantime, proceeded into the chamber as before, in the pursuance of his duties, and, on his return, they both contemplated the figure for some time. Neither of them had, however, the courage to address it or approach it, and finally quitted the room, very much impressed, and perfectly convinced that they had seen Dorian. This incident soon got spread abroad, and many people came in hopes of satisfying their own eyes of the fact, but their pains were fruitless, and even Professor Oeder, who had made up his mind to speak to the apparition, sought it repeatedly in the same place, in vain. At length he gave it up, and ceased to think of it, saying, "I have sought the ghost long enough. If he has anything to say, he must now seek me." About a fortnight after this, he was suddenly awakened, between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, by something moving in his chamber, and, on opening his eyes, he beheld a shadowy form, having the same appearance as the spectre, standing in front of a press which was not more than 2 steps from his bed. He raised himself, and contemplated the figure, the features of which he saw distinctly for some minutes, till it disappeared. On the following night he was awakened in the same manner, and saw the figure as before, with the addition that there was a sound proceeded from the door of the press, as if somebody was leaning against it. The spectre also stayed longer this time, and Professor Oeder, no doubt frightened and angry, addressing it as an evil spirit, bade it begone, whereon it made gestures with its head and hands that alarmed him so much that he adjured it in the name of God to leave him, which it did. 8 days now elapsed without any further disturbance, but, after that period, the visits of the spirit were resumed, and he was awakened by it repeatedly about 3 in the morning, when it would advance from the press to the bed, and hang its head over him in a manner so annoying that he started up and struck at it, whereupon it would retire, but presently advance again. Perceiving now that the countenance was rather placid and friendly than otherwise, the professor at length addressed it, and having reason to believe that Dorian had left some debts unpaid, he asked him if that were the case, upon which the spectre retreated some steps, and seemed to place itself in an attitude of attention. Oeder reiterated the inquiry, whereupon the figure drew its hand across its mouth, in which the professor now observed a short pipe. "Is it to the barber you are in debt?" he inquired. The spectre slowly shook its head. "Is it to the tobacconist, then?" he asked, the question being suggested by the pipe. Hereupon the form retreated and disappeared. On the following day, Oeder narrated what had occurred to Counselor Erath, one of the curators of the college, and also to the sister of the deceased, and arrangements were made for discharging the debt. Professor Seidler, of the same college, now proposed to pass the night with Oeder, for the purpose of observing if the ghost came again, which it did about 5 o'clock, and awoke Oeder as usual, who awoke his companion, but just then the form disappeared, and Seidler said he only saw something white. They then both disposed themselves to sleep, but presently Seidler was aroused by Oeder's starting up and striking out, while he cried with a voice expressive of rage and horror, "Begone, you have tormented me long enough. If you want anything of me, say what it is, or give me an intelligible sign, and come here no more." Seidler heard all this, though he saw nothing, but as soon as Oeder was somewhat appeased, he told him that the figure had returned, and not only approached the bed, but stretched itself upon it. After this, Oeder burned a light, and had someone in the room every night. He gained this advantage by the light, that he saw nothing, but about 4 o'clock he was generally awakened by noises in his room, and other symptoms that satisfied him the ghost was there. At length, however, this annoyance ceased also, and trusting that his unwelcome guest had taken his leave, he dismissed his bedfellow, and dispensed with his light. 2 nights passed quietly over. On the third, however, the spectre returned, but very perceptibly darker. It now presented another sign, or symbol, which seemed to represent a picture, with a hole in the middle, through which it thrust its head. Oeder was now so little alarmed that he bade it express its wishes more clearly, or approach nearer. To these requisitions the apparition shook its head, and then vanished. This strange phenomenon recurred several times, and even in the presence of another curator of the college, but it was with considerable difficulty they discovered what the symbol was meant to convey. They at length, however, found that Dorian, just before his illness, had obtained, on trial, several pictures for a magic lantern, which had never been returned to their owner. This was now done, and from that time the apparition was neither seen nor heard again. Professor Oeder made no secret of these circumstances. He related them publicly in court and college. He wrote the account to several eminent persons, and declared himself ready to attest the facts upon his oath. Stilling, who relates this story, has been called superstitious. He may be so, but his piety and his honesty are above suspicion. He says the facts are well known, and that he can vouch for their authenticity, and as he must have been a contemporary of the parties concerned, he had, doubtless, good opportunities of ascertaining what foundation there was for the story. It is certainly a very extraordinary one, and the demeanor of the spirit as little like what we should have naturally apprehended as possible. But, as I have said before, we have no right to pronounce any opinion on this subject, except from experience, and there are 2 arguments to be advanced in favor of this narration. The one being, that I cannot imagine anybody, setting about to invent a ghost story, would have introduced circumstances so apparently improbable and inappropriate, and the other consisting in the fact that I have met with numerous relations, coming from very opposite quarters, which seem to corroborate the one in question. With respect to the cause of the spectre's appearance, young Stilling, I think, reasonably enough, suggests that the poor man had intended to commission Hofer to settle these little affairs for him, but that, delaying this duty too long, his mind had been oppressed by the recollection of them in his last moments. He had carried his care with him, and it bound him to the earth. Wherefore, considering how many persons die with duties unperformed, this anxiety to repair the neglect is not more frequently manifested. We do not know. Some reasons we have already suggested as possible. There may be others of which we can form no idea, any more than we can solve the question, why in some cases communication and even speech seems easy, while in this instance the spirit was only able to convey its wishes by gestures and symbols. Its addressing itself to Oeder instead of Hofer probably arose from its finding communication with him less difficult, the swelling of Hofer's arm indicating that his physical nature was not adapted for this spiritual intercourse. With respect to Oeder's expedient of burning a light in his room, in order to prevent his seeing this shadowy form, we can comprehend that the figure would be discerned more easily on the dark ground of comparative obscurity, and that clear light would render it invisible. Dr. Kerner mentions, on one occasion, that while sitting in an adjoining room with the door open, he had seen a shadowy figure, to whom his patient was speaking, standing beside her bed, and catching up a candle, he had rushed toward it, but as soon as he thus illuminated the chamber, he could no longer distinguish it. The ineffective and awkward attempts of this apparition to make itself understood are not easily to be reconciled to our ideas of a spirit, while at the same time that which it could do and that which it could not, the powers it possessed and those it wanted, tend to throw some light on its condition. As regards space, we may suppose that, in this instance, what St. Martin said of ghosts in general may be applicable. Je ne crois pas aux revenants, mais je crois aux restants. That is, he did not believe that spirits who had once quitted the earth returned to it, but he believed that some did not quit it, and thus, as the somnambuli mentioned in a former chapter said to me, some are waiting and some are gone on before. Dorian's uneasiness and worldly care chained him to the earth, and he was a restant, but, being a spirit, he was inevitably inducted into some of the inherent properties of spirit. Matter to him was no impediment, neither doors nor walls could keep him out. He had the intuitive perception of whom he could most easily communicate with, or he was brought into rapport with odor by the latter seeking him, and he could either so act on odor's constructive imagination as to enable it to project his own figure, with a short pipe in the pictures, or he could, by the magical power of his will, build up these images out of the constituents of the atmosphere. The last seems the most probable, because, had the rapport with odor, or odor's receptivity, been sufficient to enable the spirit to act potently upon him, it would have been also able to infuse into his mind the wishes it desired to convey, even without speech, for speech, as a means of communication between spirits, must be quite unnecessary. Even in spite of these dense bodies of ours, we have great difficulty in concealing our thoughts from each other, and the somnambule reads the thoughts of not only his magnetizer, but of others with whom he is placed in rapport. In cases where speech appears to be used by a spirit, it is frequently not audible speech, but only this transference of thought, which appears to be speech from the manner in which the thought is borne in and enters the mind of the receiver. But it is not through his ears, but through his universal supplementary sense, that he receives it, and it is no more like we mean by hearing, than is the seeing of a clairvoyant or a spirit, like our seeing by means of our bodily organs. In those cases where the speech is audible to other persons, we must suppose that the magical will of the spirit can, by means of the atmosphere, simulate these sounds as it can simulate others, of which I shall have to treat by and by. It is remarkable that, in some instances, this magical power seems to extend so far as to represent to the eye of the seer a form apparently so real, solid, and lifelike, that it is not recognizable from the living man, while, in other cases, the production of a shadowy figure seems to be the limit of its agency, whether limited by its own faculty or the receptivity of its subject. But we must be quite sure that the form is, in either instance, equally ethereal or immaterial. And it will not be out of place here to refer to the standing joke of the skeptics about ghosts appearing in coats and waistcoats. Bentham thought he had settled the question forever by that objection, and I have heard it since frequently advanced by very acute persons, but, properly considered, it has not the least validity. Whether or not the soul, on leaving its earthly tabernacle, finds itself at once clothed with that spiritual body which St. Paul refers to, is what we cannot know, though it seems highly probable. But if it be so, we must be sure that this body resembles in its nature that fluent, subtle kind of matter, called by us imponderables, which are capable of penetrating all substances, and unless there be no visible body at all, but only the will of a disembodied spirit acting upon one yet in the flesh, in which case it were as easy to impress the imagination with a clothed figure as an unclothed one, we must conclude that this ethereal flexible form, whether permanent or temporary, may be held together and retain its shape by the volition of the spirit, as our bodies are held together by the principle of life that is in them, and we see in various instances, where the spectator has been bold enough to try the experiment, that though the shadowy body was pervious to any substance passed through it, its integrity was only momentarily interrupted, and it immediately recovered its previous shape. Now, as a spirit, provided there be no especial law to the contrary, partial or universal, absolute or otherwise, governing the spiritual world, must be where its thoughts and wishes are, just as we should be at the place we intently think of, or desire, if our solid bodies did not impede us. So must a spirit appear as it is, or as it conceives of itself. Morally, it can only conceive of itself as it is, good or bad, light or dark, but it may conceive of itself clothed as well as unclothed, and if it can conceive of its former body, it can equally conceive of its former habiliments, and so represent them by its power of will to the eye, or present them to the constructive imagination of the seer, and it will be able to do this with a degree of distinctness proportioned to the receptivity of the latter, or to the intensity of the rapport which exists between them. Now, considered in this way, the appearance of a spirit, in its habit as it lived, is no more extraordinary than the appearance of a spirit at all, and it adds no complexity to the phenomenon. If it appears at all in a recognizable form, it must come naked or clothed. The former, to say the least of it, would be much more frightful and shocking. And if it be clothed, I do not see what right we have to expect it shall be in a fancy costume, conformable to our ideas, which are no ideas at all, of the other world, nor why, if it be endowed with the memory of the past, it should not be natural to suppose it would assume the external aspect it wore during its earthly pilgrimage. Certain it is, whether consistent with our notions or not, all tradition seems to show that this is the appearance they assume, and the very fact that on the first view of the case, and until the question is philosophically considered, the addition of a suit of clothes to the phenomenon not only renders its acceptance much more difficult, but throws an air of absurdity and improbability on the whole subject, furnishes a very strong argument in favor of the persuasion that this notion has been founded on experience, and is not the result of either fancy or gratuitous invention. The idea of spirits appearing like angels, with wings, seems to be drawn from these relations in the Bible, where messengers were sent from God to man, but those departed spirits are not angels, though probably destined in the course of ages to become so. In the meantime, their moral state continues as when they quitted the body, and their memories and affections are with the earth, and so earthly they appear, more or less. We meet with some instances in which bright spirits have been seen, protecting spirits, for example, who have shaken off their earth entirely, clinging to it yet but by some holy affection or mission of mercy, and these appear, not with wings, which whenever seen are merely symbolical, for which we cannot imagine they are necessary to the motion of a spirit, but clothed in robes of light. Such appearances, however, seem much more rare than the others. It will seem to many persons very inconsistent with their ideas of the dignity of a spirit that they should appear and act in the manner I have described, and shall describe further; and I have heard it objected, that we cannot suppose God would permit the dead to return merely to frighten the living, and that it is showing him little reverence to imagine he would suffer them to come on such trifling errands, or demean themselves in so undignified a fashion. But God permits men of all degrees of wickedness, and of every kind of absurdity, to exist, and to harass and disturb the earth, while they expose themselves to its obloquy or its ridicule. Now, as I have observed in a former chapter, there is nothing more perplexing to us in regarding man as a responsible being than the degree to which we have reason to believe his moral nature is influenced by his physical organization. But, leaving this difficult question to be decided, if it can ever be decided in this world, by wiser heads than mine, There is one thing of which we may rest perfectly assured, namely, that let the fault of an impure or vicious or even merely sensuous life lie where it will, whether it be the wicked spirit within, or the ill organized body without, or a tertium quid of both combined, still the soul that has been a party to this earthly career must be soiled and deteriorated by its familiarity with evil, and there seems much reason to believe that the dissolution of the connection between the soul and body produces far less change in the former than has been commonly supposed. People generally think, if they think on the subject at all, that as soon as they are dead, if they have lived tolerably virtuous lives, or indeed been free from any great crimes, they will immediately find themselves provided with wings, and straightway fly up to some delightful place, which they call heaven, forgetting how unfit they are for heavenly fellowship. And although I cannot help thinking that the Almighty has mercifully permitted occasional relaxations of the boundaries that separate the dead from the living, for the purpose of showing us our error, we are determined not to avail ourselves of the advantage. I do not mean that these spirits, these revenants or restants, are special messengers sent to warn us. I only mean that their occasionally revisiting the glimpses of the moon form the exceptional cases in a great general law of nature which divides the spiritual from the material world, and that, in framing this law, these exceptions may have been designed for our benefit. There are several stories extant in the English, and a vast number in the German records, which, supposing them to be well founded, and I repeat, that for many of them we have just as good evidence as for anything else we believe as hearsay or tradition, would go to confirm the fact that the spirits of the dead are sometimes disturbed by what appear to us very trifling cares. I give the following case from Dr. Kerner, who says it was related to him by a very respectable man, on whose word he can entirely rely. I was, said Mr. St. S., the son of a man who had no fortune but his business, in which he was ultimately successful. At first, however, his means being narrow, he was perhaps too anxious and inclined to parsimony, so that when my mother, careful housewife as she was, asked him for money, the demand generally led to a quarrel. This occasioned her great uneasiness, and having mentioned this characteristic of her husband to her father, the old man advised her to get a second key made to the money chest, unknown to her husband, considering this expedient allowable and even preferable to the destruction of their conjugal felicity, and feeling satisfied that she would make no ill use of the power possessed. My mother followed his advice, very much to the advantage of all parties, and nobody suspected the existence of this second key, except myself, whom she had admitted into her confidence. 22 years my parents lived happily together, when I, being at the time about 18 hours' journey from home, received a letter from my father, informing me that she was ill, that he hoped for her speedy amendment, but that if she grew worse, he would send a horse to fetch me home to see her. I was extremely busy at that time, and therefore waited for further intelligence, and as several days elapsed without any reaching me, I trusted my mother was convalescent. One night, feeling myself unwell, I had lain down on the bed with my clothes on to take a little rest. It was between 11 and 12 o'clock, and I had not been asleep, when someone knocked at the door, and my mother entered, dressed as she usually was. She saluted me and said, "We shall see each other no more in this world, but I have an injunction to give you. I have given that key to R," naming a servant we then had, "and she will remit it to you. Keep it carefully, or throw it into the water, but never let your father see it. It would trouble him. Farewell, and walk virtuously through life." And with these words she turned and quitted the room by the door, as she had entered it. I immediately arose, called up my people, expressed my apprehension that my mother was dead, and, without further delay, started for home. As I approached the house, R., the maid, came out and informed me that my mother had expired between the hours of 11 and 12 on the preceding night. As there was another person present at the moment, she said nothing further to me, but she took an early opportunity of remitting me the key, saying that my mother had given it to her just before she expired, desiring her to place it in my hands, with an injunction that I should keep it carefully, or fling it into the water, so that my father might never know anything about it. I took the key, kept it for some years, and at length threw it into the line. I am aware that it may be objected by those who believe in wraiths, but in no other kind of apparition, that this phenomenon occurred before the death of the lady, and that it was produced by her energetic anxiety with regard to the key. It may be so, or it may not, but, at all events, we see in this case how a comparatively trifling uneasiness may disturb a dying person, and how, therefore, if memory remains to them, they may carry it with them, and seek, by such means as they have, to obtain relief from it. A remarkable instance of anxiety for the welfare of those left behind is exhibited in the following story, which I received from a member of the family concerned. Mrs. R., a lady very well connected, lost her husband when in the prime of life, and found herself with 14 children, unprovided for. The overwhelming nature of the calamity depressed her energies to such a degree as to render her incapable of those exertions which could alone redeem them from ruin. The flood of misfortune seemed too strong for her, and she yielded to it without resistance. She had thus given way to despondency some time, when one day, as she was sitting alone, the door opened, and her mother, who had been a considerable time dead, entered the room and addressed her, reproving her for this weak indulgence of useless sorrow, and bidding her exert herself for the sake of her children. From that period she threw off the depression, set actively to work to promote the fortunes of her family, and succeeded so well that they ultimately emerged from all their difficulties. I asked the gentleman who related this circumstance to me whether he believed it. He answered that he could only assure me that she herself affirmed the fact, and that she avowedly attributed the sudden change in her character and conduct to this cause. For his own part, he did not know what to say, finding it difficult to believe in the possibility of such a visit from the dead. A somewhat similar instance is related by Dr. Kerner, which he says he received from the party himself, a man of sense and probity. This gentleman, Mr. F., at an early age lost his mother. 22 years afterward he formed an attachment to a young person, whose hand he resolved to ask in marriage. Having one evening seated himself at his desk, for the purpose of writing his proposal, he was amazed, on accidentally lifting his eyes from the paper, to see his mother, looking exactly as if alive, seated opposite to him, while she, raising her finger with a warning gesture, said, "Do not that thing." Not the least alarmed, Mr. F. started up to approach her, whereupon she disappeared. Being very much attached to the lady, however, he did not feel disposed to follow her counsel, but having read the letter to his father, who highly approved of the match and laughed at the ghost, he returned to his chamber to seal it, when, while he was adding the superscription, she again appeared as before and reiterated her injunction. But love conquered, the letter was dispatched, the marriage ensued, and, after 10 years of strife and unhappiness, was dissolved by a judicial process. A remarkable circumstance occurred about 40 years ago in the family of Dr. Paulus, at Stuttgart. The wife of the head of the family having died, they, with some of their connections, were sitting at table a few days afterward, in the room adjoining that in which the corpse lie. Suddenly the door of the latter apartment opened, and the figure of the mother clad in white robes entered, and, saluting them as she passed, walked slowly and noiselessly through the room, and then disappeared again through the door by which she had entered. The whole company saw the apparition, but the father, who was at that time quite in health, died 8 days afterward. Madame R. had promised an old woodcutter, who had a particular horror of dying in the poorhouse, because he knew his body would be given to the surgeons, that she would take care to see him properly interred. The old man lived some years afterward, and she had quite lost sight of him, and indeed forgotten the circumstance, when she was one night awakened by the sound of some one cutting wood in her bedchamber, and so perfect was the imitation, that she heard every log flung aside as separated. She started up, exclaiming, "The old man must be dead!" And so it proved, his last anxiety having been that Madame R. should remember her promise. That our interest in whatever has much concerned us in this life accompanies us beyond the grave seems to be proved by many stories I meet with, and the following is of undoubted authenticity. Some years ago, a music master died at Erfurt at the age of 70. He was a miser, and had never looked with very friendly eyes on Professor Rink, the composer, who he knew was likely to succeed to his classes. The old man had lived and died in an apartment adjoining the classroom, and the first day that Rink entered on his office, while the scholars were singing Aus der Tiefe ruf ich dich, which is a paraphrase of the Deep Profundus, he thought he saw, through a hole or bull's-eye in the door, something moving about the inner chamber. As the room was void of every kind of furniture, and nobody could possibly be in it, Rink looked more fixedly, when he distinctly saw a shadow, whose movements were accompanied by a strange rustling sound. Perplexed at the circumstance, he told his pupils that on the following day he should require them to repeat the same choral. They did so, and while they were singing, Rink saw a person walking backward and forward in the next room, who frequently approached the hole in the door. Very much struck with so extraordinary a circumstance, Rink had the choral repeated on the ensuing day, and this time his suspicions were fully confirmed. The old man, his predecessor, approaching the door and gazing steadfastly into the classroom. His face, said Rink, in relating the story to Dr. Mainzer, who has obligingly furnished it to me, as entered in his journal at that time, was of an ashy gray. The apparition, he added, never more appeared to me, although I frequently had the choral repeated. I am no believer in ghost stories, he added, nor in the least superstitious. Nevertheless, I can not help admitting that I have seen this. It is impossible for me ever to doubt or to deny that which I know I saw. End of section 12. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.